Okay, so today we're going to have a short-ish video, shorter, let's say, about counterexamples. So hopefully by this point you understand what it takes for an argument to be an argument, or what it takes for something to be an argument, what it takes for the argument to be valid. Um, those are really core components of developing this working skill set of basic logic. And now we're going to add another one, which is the ability to understand counterexamples of two kinds and how to create them and how to evaluate them. So a counterexample it can exist in two ways. The easier kind of counterexample to conceptualize and to create is a counterexample to a claim. A counterexample to a claim is just an example that proves that the claim is false. And that's it. In fact, you probably do this all the time. Someone makes a universal claim. They say, for example, as we have here, all famous actors are jerks. A counterexample to that claim is just an example you can give that proves that that's false. That's it. So if I say, oh no, that's not true, Steve Carell is a famous actor who's not a jerk. I don't know. I think that's true, but regardless of whether it's true, that's not the point. If it is true, it would be a counterexample to this claim. Okay, that's what it takes to counterexample or to create a counterexample to a claim. A little bit harder, but not really difficult, is creating a counterexample to an argument. Now, first things first, you can only counterexample an argument. And when I say counterexample, by the way, I mean give a counterexample to. It's just a shorter way of saying that. You can only counterexample an invalid argument. If the argument is valid, it cannot be counterexampled. And that's because a counterexample to an argument is just a case or a scenario that shows that the argument is invalid. Of course, you can't show that an argument's invalid if it's valid. Okay, and to do that, what you need to do, as we've seen, if you understood what validity and invalidity was, for an argument to be invalid is for it to be possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false. That means that to provide a counterexample to an argument is to give an example, a plausible example, on which the premises are true and the conclusion is false. Okay? Now, does your scenario or your example have to be actual? Absolutely not. What it has to be is possible. So what makes this a little harder for some people is that it can feel like creating a fiction or creating an unrealistic science fiction type example. And to some extent, that's exactly what it is. And for a reason. The reason is logic is about premises guaranteeing the conclusion. The premises for the argument to be valid, it has to be such that if the premises were true, there's no possible way, it's not possible for the conclusion to be false. And so if it's invalid, it only has to meet this, to be invalid, an argument only has to meet this low bar of it being possible. There's some possible way the premises could be true and the conclusion false. And that doesn't mean that it will ever actually happen. But if it's possible, it's invalid. So sometimes you could have an argument where, look, in the actual world, generally the premises, if the premises are true, the conclusion is going to be true. I'll give you another example after this one that's on the screen, but we'll talk through that one first. But it's not valid if there's some possible way for the premises to be true and the conclusion false. All right, so consider this argument. This will be a good starting example. Some people are popular, some people are actors, therefore some people are popular actors. This is, every one of these things is true right now. But again, as we saw with validity, that doesn't tell you whether the thing is valid. And in fact, on top of that, in the actual world, when the first two things are true, it's generally going to be true that the third is true. In fact, in every case where there have been popular people and actors, I think in the actual world, some people have been popular actors. But that's not the relevant question. The question is, could 1 and 2 be true and 3 false? Is it possible? Can you imagine a way? And as you've probably had time to see on the screen right now, I've imagined a way. You could actually imagine other ways. There's often, in fact, almost always, multiple ways you can counterexample an invalid argument. And different people, if you give two people in a room that task, they'll come up with different ways, generally, of the premises being true and the conclusion false. So I say, in my case, imagine a world where there are popular people in the world, have made one true, but none of those popular people are actors. In this world, the thing that's really prized is being a philosopher. So those are the really popular people. And in this world, even though none of the popular people are actors, there are also actors in the world. And it just so happens that just nobody likes the actors. They're not popular. Now, in that world, are there popular people? Yes. Are there actors? Yes. Are some people popular actors? No. So, in the actual world, have we shown that the first two are true and the third is false? No. But we've shown that it's possible. The first two, and once you've shown it's possible for 1 and 2 to be true and 3 to be false, you've shown that 1 and 2 don't guarantee the truth of 3. 1 and 2 don't entail 3. It's not impossible for 1 and 2 to be true and 3 to be false, which, again, that means it's invalid. So I've given an example that shows it's invalid. Are there other ways to show this is invalid? Yeah. You might say that, imagine a world where not the philosophers are popular, but, only mechanics are popular. And there are actors, but nobody really knows about them because they're just making small indie films. It's not that everybody dislikes them, like in my first example. It's just that nobody really knows about them, so they're not popular. Again, 1 and 2 would be true, and 3 would be false. Okay, so that's what it takes to counterexample an argument. So let me just run through a few cases for the first kind of counterexample, counterexampling a claim, I think. I'll just put them all on the screen. Actually, let's do one at a time. All that glitters is gold. What would it take to counterexample this claim? Something that glitters that's not gold, right? Sparkles, glitter itself, right? Glitter itself is a counterexample here. I don't know of any glitter that's actually gold. I guess it could exist, but all right. This is a bad joke. If you lived through the '90s or if you saw the movie Shrek, then you know what song this is a reference to. You could counterexample this. Not all. I guess this is an important. Is a reference to a Smash Mouth song, by the way. Go look it up if you want it to be stuck in your head for 7 years. Only shooting stars break the mold. It's a good one to consider because not all claims that we can counterexample are of the form, all X are Y. This was not of that form. Only shooting stars break the mold. What would it take to counterexample this claim? You need to find something that's not a shooting star that breaks the mold. I don't even know what that means, so we're just gonna pass that one. What could break the mold that's not a shooting star? Well, it's a metaphor, so it's kind of weird. People could break the mold, if you know what break the mold means. If you don't, go Google it. It's a saying. Okay, here's a more serious claim. Now, interestingly, you do need to know about the domain in question to be able to give a counterexample. So if you don't know anything about basketball, you'd be hopeless trying to give a counterexample to this claim. When you're fouled while shooting in basketball, you get to take 2 free throws. So for that reason, if you're being evaluated in this course, I'm never going to ask you to counterexample claims that require specific domain knowledge, right? Basic math, I expect everybody to have, like very basic math. Like basic knowledge of the everyday world that everyone experiences, right? Like everybody should know, for example, that all dogs have 4 legs, or sorry, that most dogs have 4 legs. I'm not going to ask you things about like ask you to counterexample a claim about the details of the rules of some game that a lot of people don't know about. All right, put that to the side. But if you do know about basketball, you know how to counterexample this claim. If you don't know about it, you still know what it would take to counterexample this claim. You'd have to find some case where someone gets fouled in basketball and they either get to take 1 or more than 2 free throws. Or I guess no free throws. And it turns out there are lots of those. You can see that that's what it would take even without knowing anything about basketball. If you know about basketball, you're thinking about counterexamples. This claim you've probably already thought of at least 3. One is if you're fouled while shooting and you make the shot, you'll get to shoot one free throw. If you're fouled while shooting and you were shooting a 3-point shot, you'll get to take 3 free throws if you don't make the shot, that is. If you are fouled... Oh, okay, I guess those are the 2 counterexamples. I was fixing to say you can get fouled and not get to take any free throws, but that's not when you're shooting, I believe. Not a huge basketball person, but I'm pretty sure that that's true. You never get to take free throws if you're not shooting. Wait. Sorry. If you're shooting, you'll always get to take free throws if you're fouled. But you don't always get to take 2 free throws. Could be 3, could be 1. All right, so those would be 2 different ways of counterexampling that claim. All right, here's one for a different crowd of people, or maybe the same crowd. I don't know. There's probably overlap between Harry Potter nerds and basketball fans. This is, again, a reference to a made-up game in the Harry Potter universe called Quidditch. Fun fact, you can go Google this if you want. Quidditch actually exists. People have created a real-life game to mimic Quidditch in the Harry Potter universe. They literally run around on like a soccer field or something with a broomstick held between their legs and try to mimic the rules of Quidditch. Again, if you don't know anything about Harry Potter, then you won't know how to counterexample this, but you will know what it would look like to counterexample this. You'd need to find a case where a Quidditch team catches the snitch first and doesn't win. That's what it would take. Now, if you don't know anything about the universe, you won't know if that's possible or not. If you do know about it, you know that it is possible. In this game, this fictional game that J.K. Rowling made up, catching the snitch does 2 things. It gives the team that catches it 150 points, and it ends the game. But if you know that, you can, and you actually don't have to know much else about the game, you can figure out a way that a team could catch the snitch and lose. And that is if they are more than 150 points behind the other team. They would catch the snitch, they would get 150 points, but it would not put them above the number of points of the other team, but it would end the game, so they would lose. And it actually happened, interestingly, in one of the Harry Potter books. If you know that book, you get fake bonus points for this course. Okay. All music has a melody. Here's why I include this one. This is going to be more contestable. That is, you could argue more about this one. And I include it because let's talk about what it would take to counterexample this claim. It would take something that's music that doesn't have a melody. Okay? That's uncontroversial. But then when we go to argue about maybe cases that count as music that don't have a melody, then we're going to get into fun arguments. Like, I might give you an example of a piece of music, something I think is music that has a melody, that doesn't have a melody, and you might argue back on one of 2 ways. You might say, that's actually not music. Or you might say, no, it does have a melody, so it's not a counterexample. And this is a good example of 2 things. One, it's a good example of the kind of argument we're eventually going to get into that's going to be fun when we're using logic. It's not all about stupid stuff, references to Smash Mouth songs and Harry Potter and stuff. We're learning these tools with these fun, these silly little examples so that ultimately we can have meaningful arguments and disputes about real important stuff, What counts as music might be a quasi-philosophical claim. Are all cases of harming an innocent wrong, right? If someone made that claim, every time you harm an innocent person, it's wrong. Well, some people in philosophy might want to come back or in ethics might want to come back and argue against that and say, no, I can give you a case where you harm someone innocent and it's not morally wrong. So the first thing I wanted to show with this case is don't despair about these silly little examples. Eventually they're going to be meaningful and substantive, but you got to learn the logic tools first. The second thing I wanted to say about this case is that it shows you some ways that counterexamples can be disputed, right? In this case, I've tried to give you a case where there's music but no melody. And I'll give you an example. I can't remember the name of the song, but there's this piece written by, I'm pretty sure it was in the 20th century. I think it might have been in the 21st century. A guy wrote, quote unquote, a piece of music, quote unquote, that was pure silence. Now, suppose that someone tried to use that to counterexample all music has a melody. Well, someone else could come back and argue well, what they'd probably argue is that's not music. They wouldn't argue that it has a melody. Okay? But imagine So that's one thing that you could argue back against a counterexample by saying it's actually not music. You tried to give me something that's music that doesn't have a melody, but that doesn't count because that's not music. What if I maybe I think didgeridoo music, which you can go Google if you want. It's I believe it's a native Australian instrument. Um, I might say that's music, something that purely uses the didgeridoo, and um, and it doesn't have a melody. So that's a counterexample to this claim. Well, you might go and say, "Oh, I agree with you that it's music, but I am actually going to argue that it does have a melody. It's just hard to discern. It's you know, you have to listen to it for a long time and to be able to pick up the subtleties of the differences in the sounds, and it actually does have a melody." So my point is this: when you're arguing against someone's purported counterexample, um, there's a few different ways you can do that. It depends on the form of the claim. In a claim of the form all x's are y's, you could argue against a counterexample by saying, actually, you haven't given me a case of x, or actually, you have given me a case of x, but it's also y, so your counterexample doesn't work. All right, that might have gotten down in the weeds a little bit, and of course, that's only particular to that form of claim, all x's or y's. The point is, the arguments about these sorts of things can go pretty deep. You have a claim put forward, that's step one. Step two of depth would be someone trying to counterexample it, but it can go even deeper, right? Because then someone can argue that your counterexample doesn't count. It's not a real counterexample. And of course, you could try to support your claim that it's a counterexample, and it can get complicated fast. The point for this quick lesson is just to kind of understand what it is to counterexample a claim. It's pretty easy, and you don't need to overcomplicate it. It's just an example that proves the claim false. Okay, here's an argument. I want y'all to think about for a minute what it would take, or whether you can give a counterexample to this argument. So take a minute, pause. Now, this is an argument inspired by Dwight Schrute from The Office. Bears eat beets, bears watch Battlestar Galactica, therefore bears eat beets while watching Battlestar Galactica. Pretty easy to see that this is invalid. And oftentimes thinking through why it's invalid can point you towards a counterexample. Why is it invalid? Well, because even though the bears might do one thing and do another thing, that doesn't mean they do both things at the same time. Okay, so to give a counterexample is actually even more straightforward in this case than the first example I gave. Imagine a world where bears eat beets. Imagine a world where bears watch Battlestar Galactica, but in that world, the bears are really specific that they can't do both of those things at the same time. They just won't, right? Or maybe you could counterexample it in a number of ways. Maybe the beets that they eat are far removed from the sources of electricity that would allow them to watch Battlestar Galactica. Or maybe they just have this irrational grandstanding preference that you never eat beets while watching Battlestar Galactica. Now, is that wild? That's a wild world, yes. Is it possible? Yeah, it's possible. I mean, I guess you could say it's not possible for bears to have really complex preferences like that. But if that's your worry, then say, like, in this world, the handlers of the bears never let them do both of those things at the same time because of whatever irrational reason you want to. Weird world, but possible. And that shows that this argument is invalid. Okay, we're not going to do that last part. But hopefully this gave you an introduction to counterexamples of those two kinds, counterexamples to claims, counterexamples to arguments. And giving a counterexample to an argument can actually, this is a further point, can help you see whether the argument is invalid, right? So it can go both ways. You can see that it's invalid and then give a counterexample to it, but sometimes if you can't tell whether the argument is valid or invalid, try to come up with a counterexample. That's the way of kind of working backwards. So if you're in that spot, trying to provide a counterexample can help. All right, that's it for today.